So today's topic of the day is Tiananmen Square protests. As you can see in the picture given above, a Chinese man temporarily blocking a line of tanks on June 5, 1989, the day after demonstrators were cleared from Beijing's Tiananmen Square. So, why is this in news? As China, where the COVID 19 virus first hit, continues to live under the pandemic's shadow, unprecedented protests have broken out. Many believe on a scale not seen in the country since 1989. 10 people died in a fire at an apartment complex in Urumqi, the capital of the western Chinese province of Xinjiang. The people had been locked in their apartments due to China's strict home isolation policies. Since the incident, protests have picked up across the country with calls to end the brutal curtailment of people's freedom in the name of COVID. As they gather steam, these protests have increasingly drawn comparisons to the protests of the late 1980s that culminated with what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Let us now know about Tiananmen Square protests in brief. The Tiananmen Square protests were student led demonstrations calling for democracy, free speech, and a free press in China. They were halted in a bloody crackdown known as Tiananmen Square Massacre by the Chinese government on June 4 and 5, 1989. The Communists came to power in China in 1949, with Mao declaring the birth of the new nation from Beijing's Tiananmen Square. In 1978, China announced far-reaching economic reforms termed by the party as socialism with Chinese characteristics, starting with the decollectivization of agriculture. The government undertook further steps to invite foreign investment and encourage private enterprise. But while the economic reforms brought rapid changes in the Chinese society, political reforms did not follow suit. Expectations post the reforms were high, but there was also increasing discontent. Protesters called for greater freedom of speech, removal of censorship, and overall democratization of the Chinese polity. These protests were often led by students and the youths. College campuses became hotbeds of dissident activities. The first generation of students who had gone abroad to study would often return with new ideas on freedom, governance, and society. The spring of 1989 saw protests grow in the immediate aftermath of the death of Hu Yaobang. Hu was a popular leader and known for his liberal opinions. He was a key player in formulating and executing various reforms that were taking place in China in the 1980s. In the first 2 weeks of May, the protests at Tiananmen Square escalated. Shanghai, Wuhan, Changsha, and Xi'an saw protests which turned violent. Rioters vandalized public property and burned cars. On May 20, martial law was declared with as many as 250,000 troops from the PLA, that is People's Liberation Army, being sent to Beijing. On June 3, the protests turned violent as permission was granted to the military to use any means necessary to clear Tiananmen Square. The state-run television warned all citizens to stay indoors as the military moved in. At the time when the troops moved into the square, there were still close to 100,000 protesters on the site. Tanks drove through the crowd, crushing students to death. Live ammunition was used indiscriminately, with reports of the forces firing even at fleeing protesters. While the number of deaths is disputed, there is no doubt that the official number of around 300 protesters dead massively undercounts the reality. Other estimates range from between 500 to 3,000 civilian deaths. So, the Pillar of Shame statue, as you see in the picture above, commemorates democracy protesters who were killed by the Chinese troops in 1989 at Tiananmen Square. Thank you.